I'm Aaron Maté, sitting in for Jimmy Dore, here with the miserable liberal, Steph Zamorano, and Americans comedian Kurt Metzger. And I wrote this article back in April 2022. It's called Siding with Ukraine's Far-Right, U.S. Sabotage Zelensky's Mandate for Peace. And what I was arguing here was that Zelensky in 2019 was elected on a huge mandate to make peace, to end the war that began in eastern Ukraine in 2014 after a U.S.-backed coup, and to prevent further bloodshed. But he was sabotaged because the far right inside Ukraine, which are the main forces behind the 2014 coup, blocked him and even threatened his life. And the far right of Ukraine was aided by the U.S. government, which refused to use any of its huge leverage in Ukraine to support peace and end the war. And somebody who warned about this before pretty much anybody else was the late, great Stephen F. Cohen, a mentor of mine, eminent Russia scholar in the U.S. And he was attacked viciously at the end of his life because he spoke out against Russiagate, against the new McCarthyism, and because he spoke out in favor of diplomacy and peace. But back in October of 2019, back when the U.S. media was consumed with this frenzy about Trump being impeached, because remember, he froze some weapons to Ukraine, and because he did so at the same time that Rudy Giuliani was seeking dirt on Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and their corruption inside Ukraine, that got him impeached for freezing some weapons during that time. So one person to warn about how dangerous all this was, because it was encouraging war with Russia and it was discouraging diplomacy, was Stephen F. Cohen. So listen to the warning that he issued in October 2019 about how important it was to support the peace mandate of the newly elected president at that time of Ukraine, Zelensky.
You have a situation now, which seems not to be widely understood, that the new president of Ukraine, Zelensky, ran as a peace candidate. This is a bit of a stretch, and maybe it doesn't mean a whole lot to your generation, but he ran a kind of George McGovern campaign. The difference was McGovern got wiped out, and Zelensky won by, I think, 72%. He won an enormous mandate to make peace. So that means he has to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. And there are various formats, right? There's the so-called Minsk format, which involves the German and the French. There's bilateral directly with Putin. But his willingness, and this is what's important and not well reported here, his willingness to deal directly with Putin, which his predecessor, Poroshenko, was not, or couldn't, or whatever reason, actually required considerable boldness on Zelensky, because there are opponents of this in Ukraine, and they are armed. Some people say they're fascist, but they're certainly ultra-nationalist. And
he's talking about the Azov Battalion, right sector. All the people who the U.S. is now siding with, they're the ones threatening Zelensky's peace mandate.
They have said that they'll remove and kill Zelensky if he continues along this line of negotiating with Putin. So now along comes Trump, right? So Trump makes a wrong-headed phone call to Zelensky about Biden and information. It was a wrong thing to do. There were two ways of looking at that. But the more important thing is, and that's why I'd like to see the full transcript of the, we've only been given a partial so far as I know. I want to know if Trump encouraged Zelensky to continue the negotiation with Putin. And here's why. Zelensky cannot go forward, as I've explained. I mean, his life is being threatened, literally, by quasi-fascist movements in Ukraine. He can't go forward with full peace negotiations with Russia, with Putin, unless America has his back. Maybe that won't be enough, but unless the White House encourages this diplomacy, Zelensky has no chance of negotiating an end to the war. So the stakes are enormously high.
So that's the late Stephen F. Cohen in October 2019. And listen to what he says. Zelensky's life is being threatened by a quasi-fascist movement inside Ukraine who don't want him to carry through with his peace mandate that he was elected on. And his only hope of carrying through on that peace mandate is if he's backed up by the U.S.
Is that okay? Is that why Trump keeps saying there would have been peace if I had been there? Because he possibly was going to back it up?
Well, he did encourage diplomacy between Zelensky and Putin. The problem is Trump never put any weight into his words. He said good things. He talked about diplomacy, but he never did anything policy-wise to actually get behind it. He always caved to the neocons who he appointed. And that's a big reason why we have this war now. Now, it's true. If Trump was still in office under rather than Biden, would Russia's invasion happen? There's some people like Fiona Hill, who we heard from before, and also the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie, whatever her name is, the former U.S. ambassador. They said that if Trump was in office, this invasion wouldn't have happened. I think that's because they think that actually Trump would have supported diplomacy, whereas Biden did it. But it's Trump also encouraged war inside Ukraine as well, because his policies did not match his words. And so Professor Cohen there made reference to fascists inside Ukraine threatening the life of Zelensky if he makes peace with Russia. Here's an example of that. and I quote from this in my article. And this is from Dmitry Yarosh, who is the commander of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army and the co-founder of a fascist group called Right Sector. And after Zelensky said that I'm willing to lose my popularity and my ratings to make peace with Russia, this is what this fascist leader said in response. He said, no, he would lose his life. He will hang on some tree if he betrays Ukraine and those people who died in the revolution and the war. And by revolution, he means the 2014 Maidan coup and the war that has happened in Ukraine ever since then. And here's a headline from a Ukrainian newspaper. You see it there. And the headline is, it says, Yarosh, if Zelensky betrays Ukraine, he will lose not his position, but his life.
I like when idiot friends of mine, well, Zelensky's Jewish. Why would he get to be president if there's all these Nazis?
Because he's sufficiently intimidated by them and he does their bidding. He can't stand up to them because he doesn't have the backing of the U.S.
Well, these are people that, by the way, were horrified by the Unite the Right rally in Virginia.
Sure.
Which was having a brother rally in Ukraine at the same time.
Exactly. They're firmly, the U.S. government and everybody who supports the Ukraine proxy war, 100% on the side of these white supremacist fascists who Professor Cohen was talking about, and who were threatening the life of Zelensky if he made peace with Russia. And one person to point out that the U.S. was not putting any weight behind the peace process inside Ukraine, something called the Minsk Accords, which was reached in 2015 to end the war in the eastern Ukraine that began after the 2014 coup, is a guy named Samuel Cherep. He is an expert with something called the RAND Corporation, which is a Pentagon-tied think tank. And I quoted him in an article I wrote recently where Samuel Cherep said this, quoting myself here, that a change in U.S. policy could have blunted Ukraine's far right was made clear in the fateful months before Russia's invasion. As Russian troops massed on Ukraine's border in November 2021, Samuel Cherep, a senior analyst with the U.S. government-funded RAND Corporation, argued that U.S. support for the Minsk II Accords could help avert disaster. And that was the only peace agreement that was reached to end that war, and that's what Zelensky was trying initially to implement to end the war. But there was a problem, Cherep wrote. The reality is that Ukraine depends on political, diplomatic, economic, and military support from the West, and particularly from the U.S. Accordingly, that gives the U.S. significant leverage on Kiev, which at that point had been largely untapped. To date, according to Samuel Cherep of RAND Corporation, the U.S. had not used this influence to push for progress on the Donbas conflict. Instead of focusing only on coercing Russia, Cherep proposed, the Biden administration should also push Kiev to take steps toward implementing its obligations under Minsk II, which Ukraine has shown little desire to do since the deal was brokered 6 years ago. And that's because the fascist element of Ukraine was blocking any implementation of Minsk II by doing things like threatening the life of the elected president. And finally, if the Ukrainian government could be pushed toward complying with the agreement, flawed as it is, that might actually invite de-escalation from Russia and reinvigorate the languishing peace process while saving Ukraine from calamity. So that was a Pentagon-tied expert with the RAND Corporation in late 2021 warning that the U.S. only had limited time left to save Ukraine from calamity. And the way to do that would be just to support the peace agreements that already have been reached inside of Ukraine. But the U.S. didn't do that. Instead, the U.S. refused to negotiate with Russia on any key issue. And now we get more evidence of what I was talking about and what Professor Cohen was talking about, that the U.S. has been siding with Ukraine's far-right nationalists and opposing peace from the start. So this is from a recent article in the Washington Post that's headlined, "A Year in the Trenches Has Hardened Ukraine's President." And this is what they report. In between navigating a U.S. impeachment scandal, and this is right when Professor Cohen was talking before in October 2019, in between then, Zelensky spent much of his first year in office trying to make progress with the Kremlin, arranging prisoner swaps, pulling back from the front line, and working to tee up an in-person meeting with Putin, mediated by Germany and France. So this is the Washington Post that's saying that Zelensky first tried to make peace. He tried to take steps toward fulfilling his mandate. But then some roadblocks occurred, and one of them was the U.S. William Taylor, the top official at the U.S. Embassy at the time, recalled finding Zelensky in his office in the summer of 2019, expressing curiosity about the Steinmeier formula, an interpretation of the Minsk Accords named after Germany's former foreign minister that the Ukrainian president hoped might lead to a deal with the Kremlin. No one knows what it is, Taylor replied. Steinmeier doesn't know what it is. So this is the U.S. ambassador telling Zelensky, nah, this is stupid. Don't pursue this effort to revive the peace process. Zelensky, according to Taylor, grabbed his phone and pointed to a document explaining the formulation, thinking that somewhere in the details of the legalese, a workable compromise with Moscow might be found. It's a terrible idea, Taylor replied, though Zelensky went on to endorse it in the coming months, trying to land a face-to-face with Putin. So there's the U.S. envoy to Ukraine, who has very strong leverage over Ukraine, telling Zelensky that a peace effort is a terrible idea.
Now I see why Zelensky's so demanding in Congress for more money, since we basically screwed this up for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So then Zelensky and Putin meet, and they have this kind of awkward meeting, and the Washington Post says here that Putin was condescending towards Zelensky, but still, Zelensky left that meeting, and this is in December 2019, hopeful. Within weeks, Russia agreed to a broader prisoner exchange and offered Ukraine a $3 billion gas arbitration settlement, as well as a new gas transit deal. So here's Russia and Ukraine actually negotiating and reaching some accommodations. So they're making some progress. But then fast forward to early 2021, and now Biden is in office, and things have changed. And this is what the Washington Post says, and they're citing a top ally of Zelensky in the Ukrainian parliament. By early 2021, Zelensky believed that negotiations wouldn't work and that Ukraine would need to retake the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, those are the rebel regions of the Donbas, either through a political or military path. The Kremlin disengaged. So after Zelensky decided that negotiations wouldn't work, that's when the Kremlin disengaged, according to the Washington Post. And all this is new evidence that Zelensky tried to make peace. He was told by the U.S. this was a bad idea. And in the ensuing years, they didn't have his back. And so just as Stephen F. Cohen warned, he had no power or leverage to push that through. And instead, the far-right fascists of Ukraine won.
Well, that's why he had to send all that money out for, for a rainy day.
And this is new evidence of that. And so now, with a top ally of Zelensky saying that by early 2021, Zelensky had declared that negotiations were a dead end, that helps explain why in early 2022, right before Russia invaded, Zelensky refused to even speak to the Donbas rebels, and he also escalated the shelling of the Donbas region, which was a message to Russia and the rebels that Ukraine was not interested in a compromise and wanted war. And Russia responded to that by invading in February 2022, a year ago. And so that's the story. This is new evidence about how the U.S. was not on the side of peace and how U.S. actions helped lead to this war. And now this is Zelensky. So he's gone from campaigning for peace, taking some steps towards that, which I think were in good faith in the first year. Now this is him now.
There's no alternative to Ukraine and in the EU. There is no alternative to Ukraine in NATO. There is no alternative to our unity. Hence, there is no and should not be any alternative to completely get rid of Russian aggression, to liberate the land, to liberate people, because every city, town and village that remains under occupation means people staying in captivity. May people be the subject of compromise? No. We have to liberate Ukraine and Europe, because when the Russian weapon shoot at us, it is already pointed at our neighbors. May Europe be the subject of compromise? No. We have to liberate from Russia's aggressive potential every international institution and every sphere of the world economy, because only then there will be a chance for freedom to pass through our border further to the east.
So that's Zelensky now sounding like George W. Bush. We're going to pass freedom through our border to the east. So
is he forgetting the other possibility that America gets bored and hangs them out to dry like we usually do?
Yes, well, that's what he's trying to avoid. So he is sounding now like a boilerplate neocon. We're going to spread freedom to Russia via Ukraine, like any neocon crusader. So Zelensky's gone from campaigning for peace, ending the war, to now calling for more weapons and talking about spreading freedom like a neocon, and also basically making up falsehoods to try to get World War III. And by the way, this happened after what? So not only was his peace mandate sabotage before Russia's invasion. After Russia invaded, we know this, we've covered this a lot on the Jimmy Dore show at the Gray Zone as well, that after Zelensky tried to reach a peace deal with Russia, what happened? The U.S. blocked it. Boris Johnson came over from the UK and told Zelensky, we're not going to back you up if you make a peace deal with Russia. So from before Russia's invasion to afterwards, every time Zelensky's tried to make peace, he gets sabotaged, and it reduces him now to basically repeating the talking points of the neocons who've undermined him at every turn, and also making up lies to try to trigger World War III. So here's Zelensky. Ukraine caught a Russian plan to destroy Moldova. Here's another one. Ukraine Zelensky blames Russian missiles for deadly Poland explosion. Remember this, when a missile went over from Ukraine into Poland, and Zelensky said that this was Russia's fault. It turned out to be a Ukrainian missile. But what's amazing here is now Zelensky's so useful to this proxy war that German officials are now giving him a pass for lying. So listen to this passage from the Wall Street Journal. In Germany, 2 officials said there is a sense among some West European governments that Zelensky has been trying to drag the U.S. and its allies into the war, not only by seeking offensive weapon systems that could be used on Russian territory, but also with his claims that Russia had fired missiles into or over NATO territory. Okay, so basically, these 2 officials are acknowledging that Zelensky lied to drag NATO into a war. Okay, but then they go on to say this, or one of them says this: I don't blame Zelensky, one of the officials said. In his place, we would do the same.
They did. They lied about their own pipeline. That's what I'm saying. They don't blame him. Like, they're all Zelensky. That's what the difference between being an amateur. Yeah, Jimmy always says he's a pothead comedian in his basement, and like a journalist is when you learn to do what Zelensky's doing now, just say the lines that you're supposed to say and say them dutifully, and don't get ideas in your head or go off road or off script. And the end. That's exactly what they would do. They're telling the truth.
See, here's what I said. 2 German officials note that Zelensky has falsely claimed that Russia fired on NATO territory with the goal of trying to drag the U.S. and its allies into the war. But no need to fault Zelensky for lying in the hopes of starting World War III. In his place, we would do the same.
Yeah, because NATO wants to do it. Yeah. So they're like, what do you think? It's up to us to drag you into war? NATO's saying, do this to drag. We want this war. And you're going to say the thing, so it looks like you're dragging us in. It's like when I was doing a show and Roddy Piper was in the crowd, wanted to do stand-up. Roddy Piper.
Sure, yeah.
And but he wanted me to like notice him in the crowd. I did it for him. Just notice Roddy Piper, and then, hey, Roddy Piper, get up here. And he goes, no, I don't want to. I don't want to go to war, World War III. Get up here, Roddy. We want to see Roddy.
Did he have that great fight scene in They Live?
Yeah.
That's him, right?
Yeah, Roddy, yeah.
Yeah, that's an amazing, yeah. All right. So that's who the U.S. has reduced Zelensky to, a guy who was elected on a campaign of peace, who even tried after the Russian invasion to make peace. And every time he gets undermined because the U.S. fundamentally is not siding with the Ukrainian people. It's siding with the far right fascists of Ukraine. And they've gotten exactly what they've wanted, this disastrous proxy war.
I feel bad for Zelensky now a little bit because he just like, what choice does he have in any of it? He's such a little puppet. He's got nothing else. Like, what would he do? What's he going to do to even stay alive if he doesn't do what they want?
Yeah, he doesn't have to be a puppet. He could stand up to it. But yes, he has been.
You expect the leader of a country to sacrifice himself for the truth. Yeah, come on.
Doing live stand-up comedy in Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Nashville, Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets and become a premium member. Get access to all our content.